Well, if we started off this week in the Lords and in the whole of society feeling a bit down about the football result, it didn't take long before that demoralisation really set in, because the very same Monday when we were licking our wounds, we had a demonstration of the government completely rowing back on what Freedom Day would mean. And if ever the word freedom has been destroyed by caveats, it has to have been the kind of move away from saying that lockdowns were irreversible to saying you can have your freedom, but. And a real, I think, loss of nerve by Boris Johnson. And I think that has just thrown everyone into something of a bad mood, because they now are not sure, and there's all sorts of questions about where you can wear masks, where you can't wear masks. Will there be bylaws? I see that Yorkshire have just introduced, the new mayor, Tracy Brabin, has just introduced a mask wearing compulsory in all bus stations. She can't say on buses because she's not in control of that, but there's going to be all sorts of messes going on, and I think it's just really divisive. And at the same time, we've had a situation where the government sneaked through, or announced at the last minute, a vote in the House of Commons about whether vaccination for care home workers and people going into care homes, because it's a broader scope than just care home workers, should be mandated or not. Now, that is an argument. I mean, Ella, who's filming this, and I have just been talking about it. There will be different opinions as to the balance, how you protect the elderly if a substantial minority of care home workers won't get vaccinated. But it doesn't matter what you think about it. It is absolutely atrocious that the government, who had been vaguely talking about this, suddenly, before recess happens, rushes through a vote, gives 90 minutes for a discussion only, and then it gets through, but you can't say that's been given a full airing in the public sphere. And that's one of the things that is driving me mad about being involved in legislation, is realising the way that the law is being used in this way to avoid arguments, to make things forced upon society rather than having a proper discussion about it. People keep asking me, will this question come to the Lords? And what's happened is somebody, I don't actually know, Lib Dem or Labour, to give them credit, has put through a regret motion, and that means that next Tuesday there's an opportunity for the Lords to discuss it, 90 minutes again, and a vote as to whether you regret what the Commons did. I think that's the only way it could be sort of even forced onto the agenda in the Lords, so that's what's happening. I am absolutely against the mandating of vaccines. I do not think it's a good idea in terms of employment law, and I really wish the trade union movement would get involved. But I think that there's arguments for and against that need to be heard, and I do understand that there's a real moral dilemma about protecting the vulnerable. There always has been throughout this pandemic, and those who insist that the only discussion in town is their own bodily autonomy obviously need to broaden the scope of that discussion, I think, because it becomes too limited to individual freedom. And I think that freedom has to contain within it a sense of social solidarity. So I'm thinking through what I'm going to say next week. Just in terms of the other aspect of life that's been demoralising this week has been the way that instead of a conversation about the football that took on a sensible football-y form of whether the England team played well, what we thought about them, congratulating them on having done the brilliant job of bringing us all together and showing what community meant as we looked forward to the final, even if it didn't quite happen on the pitch. We've actually been subjected to a really toxic discussion on racism. And the reason I mentioned that was I put my name down to speak on a question on racism and football, didn't get selected, which was frustrating, but sat in on the debate. And I really felt in the end that the word racism was being degraded by what people were saying constituted racism, and a real gotcha atmosphere of, the opposition benches trying to catch the government out. The whole issue around whether anybody who had ever said or hinted at defending those who booed the knee originally must be part of a racist backlash or deeply felt racism throughout society. It just doesn't match up to what we know is the case, which is the vast majority of people in this country are not racist and are abhorred by it. But the reason I'm saying that is because it shows that even a well-intentioned debate, and I do think that those people who want to say we should talk about racism in society, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The footballers who didn't succeed in getting their penalties in were subjected to racist abuse, and it was vile. And some people are saying it was Russian bots, and I don't. Wherever it came from, it was vile, and it should be said that it was vile. We should be able to have that conversation without it becoming polarised and toxic. And again, if I can just plug now, the Battle of Ideas discussion on how to argue better in an era of, conformity, because it does seem to me that we are not able to talk about vaccines in care homes or racism in football or racism anywhere if people just label each other in this way and delegitimise any form of dissent or any questions that go against the kind of grain of what is the acceptable suite of opinions. And that, I think, is very destructive. I've also been talking this week about why the House of Lords and the House of Commons needs to go back to normal. There was actually one of the best debates I've been in, which was whether we should end the hybrid house, which is the kind of Zoom calls in the House of Lords and so on. And it was a, really interesting 3-hour debate, some fantastic speeches, I thought, in favour of opening up and going back to normal. But it is frustrating that although the rest of society has been told to go back to normal next Monday with major caveats, the House of Lords has decided to postpone that until September after the recess, and that just feels like one rule for them, one rule for us, or one rule for us, one rule for them type of thing, because most people have been encouraged to go back to work properly, and the House of Commons and the House of Lords won't. The House of Commons have made an odd decision, which is they've said no masks from Monday the 19th. That hasn't actually been declared in the Lords yet. No masks for MPs in the House of Commons, but if you're staff in the House of Commons, you have to wear a mask. And these kind of divisions are entirely unnecessary. And the idea that you're going to force the staff to wear masks while you don't seems to me to be not valuing them at all, and maybe there should be a course on it. I've also been involved in discussions on the Environment Bill. And the Environment Bill is not actually about climate change per se. It's not actually about net zero. It's actually, as I've said before, got some very sensible measures about environmental degradation, such as fly tipping, dumping sewage in water supplies, those kind of, making sure that we don't get rid of all of the wildlife through building and development, a perfectly reasonable aspiration. There's debates to be had, but it's become one of those Christmas tree pieces of legislation with loads of amendments being thrown at it. And one of the things that is most galling in the debates that I've been involved in is, again, the moralising that goes on. So what should be perfectly reasonable discussions have become an excuse for a hectoring tone to develop around environmentalism. That means that any of the positive aspects of the bill get sullied with all of this lecturing about the need to change our lives. I see that the FT have even said that we've got to, this is the Financial Times, that we've now got to get rid of conspicuous consumption. And what they mean is lower living standards. And that's what a lot of environmental policies will lead to, lower living standards. And in the debate on the Environment Bill yesterday, there were people saying we should abolish GDP and assess things based on environmental value. Well, let me just tell you, I hardly need to tell you, people watching this, for most people in society, they haven't got a problem with conspicuous consumption. They haven't got enough to consume. And when they have a bit to consume, they might want to be conspicuous about it. You get a nice dress, you want to hide it away, right? And you want more GDP, not less. And we need to improve living standards post-COVID, not degrade them under the auspices of green deals and all the rest of it. So it just is an irritation. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow in a private members bill, which is actually arguing that that we should introduce environmentalism into the curriculum for all schools. This is, by the way, not just secondary schools, but part of it is to introduce the training in environmental habits into nursery onwards. And apart from the fact that schools are always being told that they need to intervene to solve political social problems, it explicitly says that children are a very useful way. Young people should be influenced in this way because it will help us change the attitudes of their parents. It's an explicit use by the state, or an attempt to use the state, to inculcate one viewpoint into the nation's pupils. And I think I'm going to be opposing that. I think it's a very dangerous road to go down, but I think that it's not confined to young people. This idea that there is only one answer, and that in fact the brilliant Debating Matters competition, which encourages sixth formers to see that there are always two sides to an argument that they should read around and make their own minds up, is the tradition I would like to be associated with encouraging young people. But to say to young people, you need to understand that this is the version of an attitude to nature that is the only acceptable one, and it's now on the national curriculum, and you've got no option but to accept it or you'll fail. This, it seems to me, is propaganda and a very dangerous way to go. Just to finish up, the House of Lords is getting fuller. So despite everything, there's loads of people in at the moment, and in fact you're allowed to have guests, and Ella is going to come for a cup of tea in the tea room. It's exciting. But you're only allowed one guest, and it's for a meeting, and so we will obviously be having a meeting. That's the reason. But one of the arguments I made in relation to the House of Lords and the House of Commons opening up is what's really missing from the great estate, the palaces of Westminster, is that actually the public have not been allowed in. And usually I used to go into the House of Lords or the House of Commons as a member of the public, and it was always packed, bustling full of people, loads of people there, demanding to see their MP, lobbying on behalf of different organisations, not the paid lobbyists. And I want to emphasise that makes a difference, because when you've got the public on site, even though it's a bit formal in the Houses of Westminster, nonetheless there's a sense that there is a public outside of the legislative process. I want there to be lots more demonstrations outside, lots more lobbying by ordinary people inside, lots of visits. And I've just walked past two big groups of pupils from secondary schools being taken around by their teachers, who were pointing to the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And one of them was saying, that's where the barons live. I was going to introduce myself, but I decided I would avoid doing that. And they were being told the history. And they were excited and lively and 13 or 14. And I thought, get them inside. You want that sense, I think, as a legislator, now that that's the role I find myself in, that there is a public. And the public have been told to stay at home for too long, but have also been kept outside of Westminster. So I do hope that when things open up, I'm going to be bringing in people for lots of cups of tea, lots of school groups, lots of student groups, lots of people in to create a sense that this is a public space, and the only reason that I'm there is because of some public duty that I feel at least I have. In the meantime, should you be frustrated that that's not going to be allowed until September, the Academy of Ideas is bringing the public to Westminster, and on the 31st of July at the heart of Westminster at Church House, which is the official home of the bishops from the House of Lords as it happens, but it's a wonderful building with loads of history. It's a place where the Commons and the Lords had to meet during various wars and states of emergency, so I like that historical background. But we are having a special day called Open for Debate, 31st of July. We've just moved the venue so it's into a larger room because the tickets are selling. So there'll be hundreds of us, so come along without masks to debate 4 very important discussions of the day. Take a look at the programme, and I will see you at the heart of Westminster there. And next week will be the final week within the halls of Westminster. I will report back before I go. But then in September, you won't even just have to listen to me on this. You can actually lobby me and say, can I come for a cup of tea in the House of Lords? And I might well say yes. See you then.